Thank you, Brother Eddie. Your sympathy may be somewhat mitigated when I explain that on December 22nd I became a great-grandfather. Try again. It's a joy to be here. In fact, one daughter is here, and she is the grandmother of that aforementioned son, and then one wife is here. That's the total. And many friends from Grand Prairie in particular, and those whom we've come to know and love in this area across a lot of years. The topic that's assigned to me, building Christian homes in an immoral world, has been really covered in many ways and in many sets of words by the brethren who have spoken thus far, but I must add my way of saying these same good things. I appreciate the Brown Trail congregation and the steadfastness of this eldership from the standpoint of the Word of the Lord and the stressing of the doctrines of the Bible. We aren't hearing much these days in the world of sound doctrine. And it's refreshing to my spirit to come, and last evening, for instance, I preached myself yesterday morning over at Burbank Gardens and didn't get to hear those lessons about which I've heard good things, but last night, 3 lessons, and one brother, Johnny Ramsey by name, said that he had never heard 3 finer lectures back to back. That's highly complimentary. Maybe that's the reason the brethren included me and Johnny and another one or two just to balance things up a little bit. But they all have spoken well and bravely, and we're glad for them all. The fact is, it has never been easy to live right. Ever since our ancestress, Mother Eve, gave that fruit to Adam after eating of it herself, evil has been in the world, and the righteous folk have had to wage war against it. And multitudes have failed to produce godly families in the midst of immoral situations. But the world has always been immoral. Ever since the days before the flood, when the Lord saw that the imagination of the thought of the hearts of men was only evil continually. Genesis 6, verse 5. But you know there was an exception, a man named Noah. And he and his wife and his sons and their wives, now that's a great family, were preserved in the ark by the wondrous power of God, for he built an ark to the saving of his house. Hebrews 11, verse 7. In Noah's case, if you analyze that verse, you find warning, faith, fear, preparation, salvation. That's what it takes to build a righteous home in an unrighteous world. But only a few generations afterward, even while Shem, a survivor of that wondrous boat ride, was still alive in the earth, many of his descendants had become idolatrous, including the father and grandfather of the man we know as Abraham. Joshua tells us about that. He says they served other gods. Joshua 24, verse 2. Yet at least one of the reasons for which God chose Abraham was that I may command him, that I have known him to the end that he may command his children and his household after him, that they may keep the way of Jehovah to do righteousness and justice. Abraham was a very wealthy man. If he were in Fort Worth or Dallas today, there would be many who would be seeking appointments with him so that they could explain to him how he could invest his silver and gold and market his cattle so that it might be of great benefit to him, not to mention to them. But although Abraham was such a man, God didn't pick him out for those reasons. Abraham was a mighty chieftain. He had a trained army of 318 men, born in his own house. Let me tell you, when Abraham came to town, the town was covered up with the tents of all the people that he brought along. And so God picked him out, not for any of those reasons, and not even for all of them combined, but because he was a man of faith, and he was a good family man. Now, one of the things that isn't in the lecture material I want to add is that Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son to the glory of God. Not a lot of people are interested in doing that. there would be far more missionaries in many more lands if only the parents at home would train and equip and pray for and stand behind their sons and daughters that they might go to the far fields of the world. Instead of issuing the plaintive pleas, honey, what do you want to go over there for? Now, that kind of family hindrance will keep many people from serving the Lord in places and in ways where they might have served effectively. But within 4 generations after Abraham, the nations of Canaan had gone into such vileness that, in the biblical phrase, the land was ready to vomit them out. The sordid list is found in the 18th chapter of Leviticus, right down to incestuous, adulterous, even bestial practices, with a warning that God's people should not follow their evil ways. And they're warned that if you do, the land will vomit you out. Leviticus 18, verses 24 through 30. Moses had prepared God's people not only to reject the evils of the land, but he had prepared them to build the families that would be pleasing to God. His instructions included these familiar words from Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And thou shalt love Jehovah thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be upon thy heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children. Instruction. There's an old word, inculcation, borrowed from the Latin word for your heel. It means that you step on something and you move your foot so you grind it in. Now, that's an interesting word for instruction, isn't it? Maybe other people's heads were somewhat like mine. It takes a little bit of inculcation, heel, and maybe some other things to get the message through. Massage it in a little bit. Thou shalt teach them diligently, and shalt talk of them when thou walkest in thy house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. And thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thy hand, and they shall be for frontlets between thine eyes. If the commandments of God never depart from the parents, there will be no way that the children can avoid contact with them. Then they, too, will read them when they're written on the doorposts of the house and upon the gates. And this wonderful text about building a godly home indicates first that loving God supremely is still the most important of all the commands. May I encourage my fellow gospel preachers, preach often on love. None of the brethren will get very excited. Most of them will feel, well, one sister told me before I came in, she said, now, I've been down with the children in the nursery all morning, and I'm tired. And I told them, I'm going to go hear Brother Gibson, even if I go to sleep. So, if that happens to be your situation, just sleep on now and take your rest, but I'm glad you're here because you're interested in what's going on here. That's the most important command. And when you preach on love, not many of the brethren will say, oh, that was wonderful. You preach on love in a lectureship, you will not be swamped with invitations for gospel meetings. You've got to have something that is more, quote, exciting. When there's nothing as exciting as the love of God. Not anything. So preach on it often, and then by His help we'll practice it. Now this love must not be a silent love. It must be expressed in the daily conversation taught to the children. A survey, which I cannot document, taken not many years ago, asked fathers, how much time per day do you spend talking to your children? And some of them gave sizable amounts of time. But as best the investigators could determine, the actual amount was 36 seconds per day. Now, if you want to know what's happened to the United States of America, that's it. This love must not be silent. So when the parents love God, God becomes the centerpiece at the table, the subject matter of the devotional times, the arbiter of all the controversies. What does God think about that? That's the most vital of all the questions, isn't it? And when there's a walk by the wayside, the balancing of the clouds will demonstrate the love of God. Nature in all its faces shows His beauty, and order and design. And when night closes the day's activities, he who keeps that family will neither slumber nor sleep. A home that rises on that kind of a foundation will be solid and stable. Count the generations that are mentioned in the 78th Psalm as I read. Give ear, O people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, telling to the generation to come the praises of Jehovah, his strength and his wondrous works that he hath done. For he established a testimony in Jacob, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children. Which finger do I use? That the generation to come might know them, even the children who should be born, who should arise and tell them to their children, that they might set their hope in God, and not forget his works, but keep his commandments, that they might set their hope in God, and might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation. Psalm 78, sketching through. Did I find not less than the 5 generations I counted? There are probably more, and blessed are those who can count back the generations and find great people of God all the way back. A few years ago, a brother died at Lubbock. In conducting his funeral service, Brother Klein Payton was mentioning that they had to quit telling Brother Reed when the Lord's Day came. He was in the hospital, and he was not entirely rational. But when anybody mentioned that it was the first day of the week, he just got out of bed and started putting on his clothes because he was not about to miss services. So they had to withhold that information from him. He died one Lord's Day afternoon about 5 o'clock, and as the people gathered solemnly around his bed, watching the scope which showed the last flickering movements of the heart, finally just the straight line, indicating that the old heart had, after 93 years, given up. But he left more than 90 descendants, of whom every person of accountable years was a faithful member of the Lord's church. How's that for a Christian family? And Brother Payton said with quiet eloquence at his funeral, it was wonderful to think that Brother Reed left just in time to get over on the other side for the evening service. That's one he wouldn't have to dress for. Well, the rise and passing of the generations echoes through the Word of God like a martial refrain. It gives the teaching of the Lord's command for both the remedy of the error of the past generations, the preventive for error in the children that should be born, and the stability for the families that would be built. Because a fine old couple named Zacharias and Elizabeth were familiar with such psalms and put them into practice, God selected them to be the parents of that young man who became the harbinger of the Messiah himself. It's recorded for us by the beloved physician. There was in the days of Herod the king of Judea a certain priest named Zacharias. His wife was of the daughters of Aaron. Her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord, blameless. Luke 1, verses 5 through 7. May I ask, what chance would anybody have to build a godly family under any king named Herod? Those monsters disgraced the pages of history for generations, but this didn't prevent that humble priest from going about his duties. It didn't prevent his godly wife from growing old gracefully as an exhibit of the grace of God in a blameless life. That's the word described to them. And how her heart thrilled when she learned that her son would fulfill the words which rung down the curtain of the Old Testament revelation. He shall come to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared for him. Luke 1, verse 17. Elizabeth evidently had never heard of the view that it's all right to take the life of an unborn child and that there won't be any moral guilt or social stigma, either one. She regarded that child as exactly what he was, the gift of God. Thus hath the Lord done unto me in the days wherein he looked upon me to take away my reproach from among men. Luke 1, verse 24. That son was to live barely more than 30 years. But the world has never been the same since John strode into the valley of the Jordan and announced the coming of the King as he called on the nation to repent. Not all the Herods with all of their evil devices could stop the voice of that man of God till they severed his head from his body. And yet, like that other righteous man, he, being dead, yet speaketh. His voice left a searing imprint of truth on the conscience of Herod too. The old king must have been quavering in his voice when he said, John I beheaded, but who is this? He thought John had come back to haunt him. From our point of view, it wouldn't have been a bad idea, would it? But the remembrance of John was enough to haunt him because he came from godly parents. No amount of philosophical twisting and turning has ever been able to remove John's words from the text when he says to King Herod, and he says it, it is not lawful for thee to have her. Tell your children this story, and then tell them that means, honey, that John told the king she is a no-no. They will understand that. If some of the adults do not. So be sure. The fact of it is not lawful. He had married her. The text says that. It also says it was not lawful. You see, you can't do wrong and get by with God. And the man who came from a godly family lost his life in telling it, but think of the souls who have been influenced by John. Well, some more New Testament examples. We could not, of course, leave out Timothy. In fact, Timothy ought to be a great inspiration to all young people. Timothy's father never did become a Christian, as far as I know. When Timothy wanted to go out and preach with Paul, first thing he had to do was report to the hospital for surgery. And how many preachers would we have in the preaching school if we included that in the curriculum? You remember the circumstances, do you not? The hospital, Paul, I'm not sick. No, but if you want to preach to Jews, there's a little matter you'll have to take care of, young man. And so he did. Timothy had to suffer to preach, and so will everybody else who rightly preaches the Word of God in one way or another. So when he came to Ephesus, the elders were trained by his preaching. The church at Ephesus lived among the Gentiles who were past feeling and had given themselves over to lasciviousness. But this pure-minded boy, whom I love to refer to as the successful, sickly half-breed, just to be plain about it, that young man is one of the outstanding stories in all of the Scripture and great examples of what a godly family can produce. The last chapter of Romans is a fascinating chapter. It should not surprise us as we read the Bible that the Christians were so closely knit in those opening days of Christianity that Paul, who had never been to Rome, could write a letter and call name after name after name after name. And you know how he contacted the people? He sent the letter in care of the church. I wonder how many people might be waiting for a long time for a letter if it sent to them in care of the body of believers. But Paul knew his people, and consequently he greeted people like, let me read some of them, Asyncritus, Phlegon, Hermes, Patrobus, Hermas, and the brethren that are within. And this must be a couple of twins, Tryphena and Tryphosa. Could those have to be twins? Where else would you get names like that, anyhow? But these are real people that had come to be Christians, and here is the family of God in its closeness illustrating what every family wants to be. And that's what Paul did when he wanted to say hello to all of these saints. He just sent them all to the church and said, tell all these brethren hello for me. Furthermore, the church was made up of the stalwart families such as God would have us to produce and to become demonstrators of. You know, any of us who have worked in metropolitan areas have been disturbed by getting letters or phone calls from somebody back home. They go about like this: my son has come to your area. Here is the address. Will you please go and strengthen him or her in the faith? How many such heartbreaking calls have we made only to find that when the children left home, they really left God as well. They had no intention of really serving the Lord. Well, when a home is turned upside down, as so many are in our world, we begin to be gloomy and despairing. The brethren have said some good things about that. But what shall we say about a time when men abdicate their places of responsibility? When children show disdain for the elderly? When women are more interested in roles of authority than the gracious place of motherhood and wifely honor? Well, we could either be talking about the USA in 1985, or we could be talking about the children of God in Isaiah's day, far more than 2,000 years ago. Let me read a few verses from Isaiah chapter 3. I will give the children to be their princes, and babes shall rule over them. The base shall behave himself proudly against the old man, the child shall, and the base against the honorable. As for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, they that lead thee cause thee to err, and destroy the way of thy paths. And so interested in finery rather than in godliness and faith were the women of long ago, that the Lord said, they walk with outstretched necks and wanton eyes, walking and mincing as they go. Mincing has nothing to do with making pies, lady. That's talking about tiny little steps. I got a word for you. Prissy, that's what they were. You can understand that, can't you? And Isaiah could see they were walking and mincing as they go. They must have worn little bells around their ankles. He speaks of the tinkling sound. And therefore the Lord will smite with a scab the head of the daughters of Zion, and Jehovah will lay bare their secret parts. This picture is a complete picture of a decadent society where morals are perverted, and decoration is mistaken for devotion, and impudence is a mark of honor. That led to the fall of God's people in earlier centuries, and calling such lifestyle by a new set of names will not make it any more acceptable to the Lord. If these allergies will let me, I'd like to read you Mr. Benjamin Spock's apology. Dr. Spock's Baby and Child Care was a handbook for multitudes of young mothers in another generation. But the day of reckoning came. In a UPI dispatch of 1979, there was this solemn renunciation. Dr. Benjamin Spock, author of the book on baby and child care, is ready to admit that he must share part of the blame if today's children are brattier than those of yesteryear. Spock said in an article, this was the February 1979 issue of Redbook magazine. He laid the blame for brattiness of America's children, at least in part, on the experts. The child psychiatrists, psychologists, teachers, social workers, and pediatricians, said he, like myself. Isn't that unusual for an expert to say that he has been wrong? He continued, in the 20th century, parents have been persuaded that these are the only people who for sure know how children should be managed. And sadly, he wrote, this is a cruel deprivation that we professionals have imposed on mothers and fathers. Of course, we did it with the best of intention. We didn't realize until it was too late. Remember who's speaking. How our know-it-all attitude was undermining the self-assurance of parents. There's a whole lot more, but I would recommend an ancient bit of doggerel. Parents, when raising a child by the book, can, if sufficiently vexed, hasten results by applying the book as well as applying the text. Get you a psychology book, a good big one, and hit that kid hard enough with it, and he'll get the point. Now, another thing that, you don't believe that, huh? Surely one of the most successful attacks against the home is in the nature of our everyday living and the attachments that are performed to pursue life. If you will think of a home, for instance, where the father is a mason, well then what? Long ago the men of the order learned that mother's not going to be too happy every lodge night. So what did they do? They arranged an auxiliary for the ladies, the Order of the Eastern Star. What are Junior and Little Sister going to do? Enter Demolay for the boys and the Rainbow Girls or Job's Daughters or some other group for the children. And what chance do we have to insert the gospel into such a home life when there is also all of the activity of the week, going to school, band practice afterward, practicing for the play at night, pep rallies, Heinz 57, variety of other things to claim all the time of the day. Busy here and there may be the epitaph of many a Christian family, where it is buried in the cemetery of overwork by the morticians called stress, strain, struggle, and company. That's sad. A brother who had lived in Korea told me many years ago, and it wasn't uncommon as you walked along a road to see an Oriental just sitting down. Might be some unusual place, but he's just sitting there. And if you knew him well enough to ask, you go and ask him, what are you doing sitting here? And he says, I'm waiting for my soul to catch up with my body. Now, there's something pretty smart about that. Our souls have been outrunning our bodies for a good while. In the book of Psalms, it talks about how man goeth forth to his labor. I wonder what the psalmist would have written if he had been on Highway 360 north at 6:30 this morning. Man not only goeth forth, he goeth 5th and 6th and 7th and 28th and 49th, and for you to get in there at all is taking your life in your hands. That's the way we live. We are so busy that we haven't time to live. We've been making a living and forfeited living, and our families suffer because of it. There's an Old Testament story that indicates that even family worship can be dangerous. It's in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is cautioning all these people, warning them against burning incense to other gods. There's a great assembly of them, including the women. And they said to Jeremiah, as for the word thou hast spoken to us in the name of Jehovah, we will not hearken unto thee. They said, you just won't forget that, Mr. Prophet. We aren't going to listen to you. Here's the way they expressed it. We will certainly perform every word that is gone forth out of our mouth to burn incense unto the Queen of Heaven. That may give a little jolt to you if you grew up in a Catholic tradition. The Queen of Heaven? That isn't talking about Mary, the mother of Jesus. That's talking about a horrible goddess of a pagan nature to whom all kinds of sexual rites were offered. We burned incense to the Queen of Heaven and poured out drink offerings unto her. Then everything was fine. We had plenty. Jeremiah in vain labored to point to them that was the real problem. If you'll read all of his story about that, you'll find that Jeremiah pictures the fathers as building the fire, and the mothers as baking the cakes for making the offering to the goddess, and the children is gathering the wood. Now, if that isn't family worship, I don't know how you do it. They're all involved in a worship to the wrong God, or in this case, goddess. To what does your family give honor? And what is your family really united? Think about it and pray about it. May I mention another thing or two? There's the teaching of evolution. There is no way to estimate the harm that is coming to the world because of the teaching that man has arisen from the lower forms of life. This view is not so much taught in our educational systems, though it is, as it is taken for granted. Now, anyone who comes to believe that he's simply a high-grade animal may sooner or later decide to gobble up any animals that he considers of a lower variety, and nobody ought to be astonished about that. That's just animal behavior. The offspring of God? No, the accidental product of eons ago. That's all that man is. And there's no way to estimate the damage that has done to the home. Then, of course, there's the excessive emphasis on entertainment. Entertainment is good. It can be helpful if kept within proper limits of decency, but control your family entertainment or it will control you and determine the course of life. The downgrading of marriage is another thing. There's a segment in our society that's never going to have much of a problem about divorce. The reason is they don't bother to get married in the first place. They just put both names on the mailbox and put their toothbrushes in the apartment, and they're in business. And that, you see, is a horrible way to desecrate the family that God intended for the protection of the home. Brother Jack Orbison said such good things about that. The purity of the sex life, the care of the little ones that come into the world, and the eventual glory of God, which will help us all in every way. I'd like to mention 3 or 4 more chapters, just mention them, that I didn't even attempt to cover in the lecture. I want to mention Genesis chapter 24. When you're thinking of a marriage in the family, read that beautiful chapter again. Notice how Abraham's steward was given to prayer, how Abraham would not settle for anything less than a suitable marriage for his son, and how that turned out so well and so happily. Then read the chapter about Dinah, Genesis 34. Notice the little verse that says, Dinah went out to see the daughters of the land. Where were her brothers? Where was her father? What about her mother? An unsupervised girl, and what happens? She falls into a circumstance where she is taken by one of the outstanding young men of the area and is raped. What a tragedy. Lack of supervision. It's not stated in the text. It's clear that it doesn't have to be. She went out to see the daughters of the land. May I encourage you to be sure where your daughters are going and with whom they are going. Another chapter, read that chapter in Jeremiah, I believe it's 35, about Jonadab, the son of Rechab. There's a curious thing. Jeremiah is told to invite all these men in. They've come into town for fear of the Babylonians, and fill up some vessels with wine and offer them all something to drink. And they said, no, we won't drink it. Now, there was no prohibition in the law of Moses against drinking wine. But how did these people decide we will be teetotalers? The reason was they had an old daddy that said, sons, don't ever drink. And they didn't. It was that simple. And God used that man as an illustration of what a family ought to be because he commanded his sons and they obeyed him. When God commands his sons, do we obey him? But that's enough. The Bible is full of illustrations. Pray a lot, work a lot, commit your soul to the Lord, know where your children are, spend time with them, eat with them. Most of all, get the family together for meals and the discussion of the day's activities. And may God help you to have sons and daughters who will grow up to the glory of God. Thank you very much.